Welcome back. Today we're going to talk a bit about the history of special education and where did it all begin. Much of the conversation around educating those with disabilities was a result of the World War II veterans returning from war, many having physical and even intellectual disabilities due to the combat. This began the conversation of how do we rehabilitate or how do we provide vocational programs for our veterans. This occurred throughout the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. And during the 1950s and 60s, we began to develop assessment tools to determine an individual's intellectual ability. This is when we first saw IQ tests. The civil rights movement of the 1960s also encouraged the conversation around the civil rights of those with disabilities. Court cases began to appear. Park versus the Board of Education, which Park is the Pennsylvania Association of Retarded Citizens, became the first movement towards addressing children with disabilities and the right to education. Mills versus the Board of Education in 1972 was a court case out of California that questioned whether or not we could prohibit children who may have disabilities and who were second language learners the right to an education. Then the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Section 504, addressed this vocational educational need and the right of it for those with disabilities, whether they were in school or in the workplace. The Education of All Handicapped Children Act did not come into law until 1975. It came in on the heels of the Rehabilitation Act and conversations regarding the rights of those with disabilities. Previously known as Public Law 94-142, the Act for the very first time in the United States provided special education programming and services and a free and appropriate education for all children. In 1978, the Gifted and Talented Education Program Act came to be. In the GATE program, children with intellectual abilities, primarily in academic areas, were first identified. In 1979, IDEA, or the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, had to be implemented in our public school systems for kindergarten through 12th grade. Since it was passed in 1975, public school districts had 4 years in order to start the implementation of these services. This allowed districts to determine not only the services for children with disabilities, but also for children who needed GATE services. In 1983, the law was amended again, known as the Public Law 98-199. This is when we first saw parent education opportunities to educate parents around how to best support their children with disabilities at home. At the same time, the Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights law came into play. And this highlighted even further that we give rehabilitation services, vocational services to those with disabilities. The Perkins Act of 1984 continued to emphasize this need to address individuals with developmental disabilities. People with disabilities were able to receive better services and vocational training. The Handicapped Children Protection Act of 1986 assured parents of their rights and their safeguards in being able to have a voice in the education of their children. It gives services for children ages 0 to 3, and the development of the Individualized Family Service Plan came to be. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was amended in 1986, and this amendment brought about vocational educational opportunities for children with disabilities between the ages of 18 through 21. The Education of All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. Although it was amended several times, it was not until 1997 that the Act was not only amended, but its name changed to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We see the difference in the name of the Act simply by using People First language. No longer is it handicapped children, it is individuals with disabilities, giving people dignity. The reason for the changes were expectations as to how children with disabilities were to be educated, the practices by which we do so, and to align with paperwork in order to make sure children with disabilities were truly receiving a free and appropriate public education. Changes in the law included parents' access, parents being able to be part of the team, children's access to their education, focusing on teaching. How do we go about teaching this population of students? Cost, having the federal government supply more funding to help offset state costs. It addressed diversity, cultural, language, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic. It brought in the piece of discipline on the manifestation determination. And lastly, it affected private schools. Children who had been attending private schools based on their parents' placement no longer qualified for services under special education unless the public school district elected to provide those services. In 2004, IDEA was amended again, and its name slightly changed to include the word Improvement Act. However, we still refer to it as IDEA. Each child must be taught by a highly qualified special education teacher. Children have to be exposed to the general education curriculum. Also, the manifestation of the process of shifting the burden onto the school to help parents to demonstrate behaviors correlated with the disability and not that the behaviors were outside of the disability. What that means then, the manifestation determination, we're determining, is the behavior a result of the disability, or is the behavior just the child having behavioral concerns? And the Act moved the transition age for individualized transition services back to the age of 16. Along with the amendments of 2004, autism and traumatic brain injury were added to the areas or the categories of disability. Transition plans, which were moved to the age of 16, must also look at rehabilitation counselors and social work services in order to develop those plans. Terms that you need to know: remediation, mainstreaming, inclusion, and belonging. Remediation is when we reteach a concept the exact same way and the child grasps it. Maybe the child was out sick, maybe it's been a long summer vacation, or maybe a long holiday break, and the child has simply forgotten the concept, and reteaching it the exact same way is remediating it. Mainstreaming is when we bring a child from a special education classroom into the typical classroom, the general education classroom. Mainstreaming means that the child is able to perform at grade level without any accommodations or supports. Oftentimes we do this with music, art, PE. And sometimes for a child who struggles with English language arts and they're at grade level at math, they will go back into the general education classroom, perform independently on their own at grade level. Inclusion, well, what is inclusion? Inclusion is not defined in the law, and I have seen dozens of different ways that inclusion is defined within a district. Including a child in the general education classroom means that they are present in that classroom, interacting with peers, maybe working on grade level or off. A newer term, belonging, is coming into our conversations more and more often. I use the work of John Swinton to define belonging, and that belonging is when we belong to a group and we are absent, we are missed. Therefore, when we belong, we bring a component to that classroom, to that community that is special, that people want within that classroom or community, and that when we are absent from it, there's a piece missing from that classroom or community. So think about those 4 terms as we work through the course material together.